20 years of marriage ended with one sentence. I never married you for love. I only needed someone to take care of my sick mother. Before I could even process those words, my husband dragged my suitcase to the front door, shoved it into the pouring rain, and locked me outside. I stood there soaked, humiliated, and convinced my life was over. But neither he nor his family knew one thing I'd quietly discovered just days earlier, a secret that would completely change who actually owned their future. By the next evening, the man who threw me out was standing at my door, begging for a conversation he never thought he'd need. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 49 years old, and until 3 months ago, I believed I had a marriage most people would envy. For 20 years, I stood beside my husband, Daniel, through every challenge life threw at us. We weren't wealthy, but we had a comfortable home, steady jobs, and what I thought was mutual respect. We never had children, partly because Daniel's mother, Margaret, became seriously ill only a year after our wedding. Her condition gradually worsened until she needed full-time care. Without hesitation, I stepped in. I reduced my work hours, turned down promotions, canceled vacations, and slowly watched my own dreams fade into the background. Every morning began with medication schedules, doctor's appointments, preparing meals, helping Margaret dress, and making sure she never felt alone. Some nights I barely slept because she needed someone beside her. I never complained. Margaret often squeezed my hand and whispered, "Emily, I don't know what I'd do without you." I always smiled and told her, "We're family. That's what family does." Daniel used to thank me too, at least in the beginning. As the years passed, his appreciation disappeared. He started working longer hours, claiming new responsibilities at the office. Weekend business trips became normal. Family dinners became rushed conversations before he disappeared into his home office. Whenever I asked if everything was okay, he would simply say he was tired. I convinced myself marriage had seasons. Some were easier than others. Margaret noticed the distance long before I admitted it. One afternoon, while I helped her sit by the living room window, she looked at me quietly. "Has Daniel been treating you well?" I smiled automatically. "He's just under pressure." She studied my face for several seconds before nodding, though I could tell she didn't believe me. A week before she passed away, she asked me to help organize the drawer beside her bed. As I folded a few old photographs, she slipped a sealed envelope into my hands. "Don't open this now," she whispered. "When the time comes, you'll know." I frowned. "What does that mean?" She simply smiled, squeezed my hand, and closed her eyes. 6 days later, Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was beautiful. Friends, neighbors, and relatives all spoke about her kindness. Everyone thanked me for caring for her for so many years. Everyone, except Daniel. He barely spoke during the reception. His face remained cold, almost impatient, as though he wanted the day to end. Over the next several days, something changed. He became distant in a way I'd never seen before. Then, exactly 1 week after the funeral, he asked me to sit in the living room. His expression held no sadness, only indifference. "We need to talk." I nodded slowly. "I've already contacted a divorce attorney." For a moment, I honestly thought I'd misunderstood him. "What?" He leaned back and looked directly into my eyes. "I never married you because I loved you." My chest tightened. "I married you because my mother needed someone to care for her." The room fell completely silent. "You served your purpose," he continued calmly. "She's gone now. I don't need to pretend anymore." Before I could even speak, he carried my suitcase to the front door, threw it onto the porch, and opened the door as heavy rain poured from the night sky. "Leave." The door slammed. The lock clicked. I stood there soaked, shaking, staring at the home I'd devoted 20 years to. Then I remembered the sealed envelope still hidden inside my purse. For the first time that night, I wondered if Margaret had already seen this coming. I spent that first night in my car. The rain finally stopped sometime after midnight, but I never noticed. My thoughts kept replaying Daniel's words over and over. "You served your purpose." After 20 years together, that was all I had become to him. A purpose. Nothing more. Around sunrise, I parked beside a quiet lake and finally remembered the envelope Margaret had slipped into my hand a week before she died. My fingers trembled as I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter. Emily, if you're reading this, then I was right. My son failed you. I prayed every day that I was wrong, but mothers know their children better than anyone. You loved me when you didn't have to. You cared for me without expecting anything in return. You gave me dignity during the hardest years of my life. You became the daughter I never had. Please forgive Daniel, but never let him destroy your future. There are documents enclosed. Follow my attorney's instructions. Everything has already been arranged. Love always, Margaret. Tears blurred my vision. Behind the letter sat another sealed packet containing a business card. Richard Lawson, family attorney. There was also a handwritten note. Meet him before speaking to Daniel again. I called the number immediately. Mr. Lawson answered after only 2 rings. His voice softened the moment I introduced myself. I've been expecting your call, Emily. We met that afternoon. He welcomed me into his office, placed a thick folder on the conference table, and quietly slid it toward me. Margaret came here 8 months ago. I looked up in surprise. She told me she feared her son was changing. He opened the folder. Everything you're about to see became legally effective before her passing. Inside were signed documents transferring ownership of Margaret's investment account, several valuable family heirlooms, and a small lakeside cottage she'd inherited from her parents. Every asset listed my name, not Daniel's. Mine. I stared at the papers in disbelief. I don't understand. Mr. Lawson smiled gently. Margaret said one thing very clearly. He adjusted his glasses before reading directly from her written instructions. My daughter-in-law earned these through love. My son expected them through blood. There is a difference. The room became perfectly still. Can Daniel challenge this? I finally asked. Mr. Lawson calmly shook his head. No. Every document was prepared properly. Margaret was fully competent when she signed them. Her wishes are legally protected. For the first time since Daniel threw me out, I felt something besides heartbreak. I felt seen. Someone had noticed every sacrifice I'd made. Someone had valued them. Meanwhile, Daniel apparently knew none of this. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with messages from mutual friends. Daniel had already begun telling people we'd simply grown apart. He acted as though the divorce would be quick and uncomplicated. Then, everything changed. According to one friend who still worked with his cousin, Daniel had confidently started discussing renovations for the family cottage, assuming he'd inherit it automatically. Instead, the estate attorney informed him every major asset had already been transferred. His inheritance had become little more than personal keepsakes. That same afternoon, his relatives reportedly began calling him nonstop. Nobody understood why Margaret had left nearly everything to me. Nobody except Margaret herself. Just before sunset, my phone lit up. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. For the first time in 20 years. His voice wasn't confident. It was panicked. And before I answered, I realized something important. The man who had thrown me into the rain wasn't calling because he missed his wife. He was calling because he'd just discovered what his mother had chosen instead. I let Daniel's first call go to voicemail. Then the second. Then the third. By evening, he'd left 7 messages, each sounding more desperate than the last. Emily, please call me. We need to talk. This is all some misunderstanding. I listened without feeling anything. The man who had looked me in the eyes and said I'd served my purpose was suddenly searching for my kindness again. The next morning, there was a knock at the front door of the small guest house where my friend Karen had insisted I stay. When I looked through the window, Daniel stood outside holding a bouquet of white lilies, my favorite flowers. 2 days earlier, he'd thrown me into the rain. Now he wanted forgiveness wrapped in ribbon. I opened the door, but remained inside. What do you want? He forced a tired smile. Can we talk? We're talking. His eyes searched my face. I made a terrible mistake. I folded my arms. Which mistake? The divorce? Throwing me out? Or telling me you only married me to care for your mother? His smile disappeared. I wasn't thinking clearly. No, I replied calmly. You were thinking very clearly. You planned every word. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he sighed. My mother's attorney made a mistake. I almost laughed. So that's why you're here. It isn't about money. It isn't. He hesitated just long enough to answer for me. The cottage. The investment accounts. The jewelry. They should stay in the family. They are in the family, I answered quietly. Margaret chose her family. His expression hardened. You manipulated her. I shook my head. No, Daniel. Kindness isn't manipulation. For 20 years I cared for your mother because she deserved compassion. I never expected anything in return. You expected everything in return. His face turned red. Those assets belong to me. I stepped aside and picked up Margaret's letter from the table. Without handing it to him, I read one sentence aloud. My daughter-in-law earned these through love. My son expected them through blood. There is a difference. Daniel lowered his eyes. For the first time since our marriage ended, he had no argument. Just then another car pulled into the driveway. Richard Lawson stepped out carrying a briefcase. He greeted us both politely. I thought it best to deliver the final estate documents personally. Daniel immediately turned toward him. Tell her this can still be reversed. Mr. Lawson answered without raising his voice. It cannot. Every transfer was completed legally. Margaret understood every document she signed. Her wishes are final. Silence settled between us. Daniel looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. Not because he'd lost money. Because he'd finally realized his mother had understood exactly who he had become. He slowly turned toward me. I'm sorry. This time I believed he meant the words. But sincerity couldn't erase 20 years of deception. I hope someday you become the man your mother believed you could be, I said softly. But that journey won't include me. He nodded once, walked back to his car, and drove away without looking back. 6 months later, I sold the lakeside cottage and used the proceeds to open the small senior care center I'd dreamed about for years. Every room carried Margaret's favorite flowers. Every resident was treated with the dignity she had taught me to give others. Losing my marriage felt like the end of my life. Instead, it became the beginning of one built on honesty, self-respect, and peace. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money. It's finally discovering your own worth.